Good morning. I'm almost embarrassed to be here after some of the earlier presentations that we saw, starting with the one on jazz music. Mine is going to be a fairly formal and perhaps intense presentation, and I apologize in advance for that. But let me start by asking, how many of you sat glued to your television sets and watched the outcome of the state elections recently? Good. So it's a much smarter audience that did not sit glued to the television sets. If you did, then there would be certain views and opinions that you formed of the outcomes of those elections, consciously or subconsciously shaped by the media narratives around in television and in print. Don't believe any of it. Why do I say this? That's the purpose of my talk today. The point that I will do over the next course of 20 minutes is to take data that is publicly and already available, do some simple work and analysis around it to show you how most media narratives of electoral outcomes that we hear are just pie in the sky narratives. Let's start with the most recent election of 2014. So the 2014 election was fairly a landmark election in the sense that a single party won a majority in the Lok Sabha since 1984. If you looked at the media narratives, and generally perhaps we still believe that the 2014 Lok Sabha election was a tsunami that swept the nation. The entire nation of India placed its faith in one person, or it was the entire nation voted for this one political party or one leader. I will tell you that the 2014 electoral victory of the BJP-led NDA was the least national of all electoral victories in the history of Indian elections. Why do I say that? When we talk about national victory, when we talk about a wave sweeping the nation, we assume it's fairly widespread. It pans across the length and breadth of the country. It goes to the north, the west, the east, and the south. The north and west of India, what I call Hindi states, either Hindi speaking or Hindi understanding, Maharashtra included, Punjab, and form 60% of all voters of India. The south and the east form 40%, so it's not 50-50, but it's fairly there, it's 60-40. The BJP-led NDA won 85% of its seats from the Hindi states and a mere 15% from the south and the east. 40% of the country actually did not really get affected by this tsunami or the wave that we talk about. And this difference is the starkest in India's electoral history. And these graphs show you that since 1977, which was an 80-20 split as opposed to an 85-15 split today, and that was the election after the emergency, the famous loss of Indira Gandhi. And even back then, the voters in the south and the east didn't really bother much about the emergency actually. So they actually did vote for the Congress party, even in the 1977 election, something that we miss in the larger narrative. So this narrative that there was a big national wave that swept the nation is perhaps a bit far-fetched, as the data shows. And more importantly, BJP-led NDA won 90% of all the seats that were on offer in the Hindi states and a mere 20% in the non-Hindi states. So this difference is perhaps the starkest in India's electoral history. The next was, perhaps all of you I'm sure are big Facebook and Twitter and Snapchat and Instagram fans. There was this, if you went through the narrative of the 2014 elections on the role of social media, CNN called it India's first social media election. Everybody said that campaign speeches will be replaced by 140-character messages on Twitter. Attendance in political rallies do not matter anymore. You only have to measure likes and dislikes on Facebook. Based on data from Facebook and Twitter that supply data, that provide this data, out of the 543 constituencies in the Lok Sabha, 160 are what's considered highly penetrated, which is 95% of all Facebook and Twitter users and other social media come from these 160 constituencies of India. This is data that's provided by Facebook, Twitter, and other social media organizations. They are called high impact social media constituencies. In these 160 constituencies, more than 70% of the winner or the runner-up, the number one or the number two candidate, had no social media presence in the 2014 election. Forget the impact, they did not have a social media presence in these high impact constituencies of social media. In the remaining 30% that had, in more than half the cases, 60% of the time, the losers had a larger social media presence than the winners. Including in this constituency of South Mumbai, the loser had a much larger social media presence than the winner. So we can understand why the narrative came to be, because the prime ministerial candidate then, Mr. Narendra Modi, had such an overpowering influence on social media, and the election was all about him. We were led to believe that this election was all about social media, when in fact the data clearly shows it had actually very, very little impact. So then to argue that it was India's first social media election, or the narrative that India's first social media election, is a bit far-fetched. Now this is a number that perhaps some of you interested in current affairs recognize. This is that famous 1.76 lakh crore number. This is the 2G scam. The 2G scam, there are 10 zeros in there, by the way. The 2G scam allegedly masterminded by this man, A. Raja, as the cabinet minister for telecom. The narrative is the 2014 loss of the UPA was because of people's anger and angst against these scams. The tenure of the UPA was scam ridden, which is perhaps true, and the voters were angry about it, and thus they booted them out. Let's take the case of A. Raja, the poster child of what was called India's biggest scam in its history. A. Raja comes from a constituency called Nilgiris in Tamil Nadu. A. Raja contested in 2009, won his election, went on to become a cabinet minister for telecom, and then allegedly masterminded this scam, was put in jail, pilloried, and then in 2014 he was released and went back to Nilgiris to contest in the 2014 elections. So he went from being a winner, cabinet minister, jailed, pilloried, and back as a candidate. 40,000 more people voted for A. Raja in 2014 than 2009. For a man who supposedly masterminded this, you would have thought at least his popularity would have dipped by half, when really this election was all about voter angst against these scams. 40,000 more people voted for him in 2014 than 2009. But he did lose. He lost not because fewer people voted for him. He lost because of the quirks of what's called the first past the post system, where the opposition votes got united. But the fact is that people didn't really care. Another case is one of Lalu Prasad Yadav, who was convicted and could not contest the 2014 election. So what does he do? Feels his wife in the same constituency, 15% more voters vote for his wife, knowing fully well that the person cannot contest because he's been convicted of corruption. So then to argue that the entire 2014 election was about corruption and about scams is a bit far-fetched, isn't it? So for those of you that are economists in this academy, this is a favorite narrative, which is, or rather I would say a hope, that voters vote for development, and development as measured through GDP growth. And there is increasingly a larger narrative about how GDP growth matters. GDP growth really impacts electoral outcomes. So what does the analysis say? The analysis is fairly straightforward here. When we look at about 250 million voter choices over a 15-year period, and you compare GDP as measured through agriculture GDP, state GDP, national GDP, and ask the question, if GDP is higher, did the incumbent government get rewarded? And if the GDP was lower, were they punished? Absolutely no evidence of any of that. So there is no evidence. In fact, when an incumbent wins or loses an election, there is no relationship to whether GDP growth was higher or lower, either in the year of the election or during the entire 5 years of the tenure of the government, all of that. So then the narrative that development, now voters vote for development, again is without any evidence. The other similar economic parameter is about price rise. Voters get angry about price rise, and that has an inordinately large impact on electoral outcomes. And price rise is measured through inflation in economic terms. And when we look at the data, inflation, and this is inflation is measured through, say, a CPI inflation, either at the national level or at the state level. The purple line here shows the inflation, the CPI inflation index. The red lines are the ones where the incumbent government lost a re-election, and the green lines are the ones where an incumbent government won the re-election. So if price rise was really an issue, as measured by inflation numbers, then when inflation is high, incumbent government should be thrown out. And when inflation is low, perhaps even if they're not re-elected, perhaps it should not matter as much. But this clearly shows that there is no relationship. The number of times incumbent gets re-elected is almost the same during times of high inflation or low inflation, and the number of times that the incumbent gets thrown out is around the same during times of low inflation and high inflation. This is not to argue that the price rise does not matter. This is not to argue that it does not have an impact. It perhaps does. But to say that this plays a very, very important role in determining electoral outcomes is again a bit far-fetched. Let's move to the next one, please. So this is another one about the 2009 Lok Sabha elections. When the UPA came back to power in the 2009 elections, the hero of this victory was supposed to be the Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, what's called the Mahatma Gandhi Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme. And the narrative was that this scheme really helped the poor, and the poor voted for the Congress back, and thus they are back in power, and hence we are only going to follow such policies going forward. And this is a somewhat complex slide, but I'll explain. So this shows disbursement of Narega wages, which is Narega cash being paid to people in districts, and the vote share of the Congress-led UPA across the 12 largest states. Now, if there was indeed a relationship where people were so happy that because of Narega that they voted for the Congress, and then this should have been like starting off small as a bubble and bubbling up across a diagonal line, because there are districts where there's been no Narega, and there are districts where there has been very heavy Narega payments made. And the Congress vote share or the UPA vote share should have varied significantly. This shows that this is nothing but just a random smattering of bubbles with no relationship whatsoever. The only perhaps closest relationship you can see is in this, which is the state of Tamil Nadu, but really across most of the states there's no relationship. And the last narrative that I'll come to, I'm running out of time here, is because we just concluded these state elections, the generally accepted narrative is voters are so astute that they vote differently, they know that they vote differently between a state election and a Lok Sabha election. And this is a fairly well entrenched narrative that whenever you talk to people, people say, okay, no, but this is a state election, that's a national election, so people vote differently. We tested about 300 million voter choices in over 15 years in 16 different elections. And what did we test? When voters were handed 2 ballots at the same time, simultaneous elections, for your state election and for the Lok Sabha election, how do they vote? All else is common, all else is the same. When you were handed 2 ballots at the same time, 77% of the time voters voted for the same party in both. There is no evidence to suggest that voters vote differently between the state and the national elections. So, you know, very often I'm asked, so what does explain electoral outcomes? So fine, you've said all of these are wrong, don't believe any of this. So what is the explanation? And the simple answer is we don't know. And my argument is, a we don't know is a perfectly acceptable and perhaps a more judicious answer to the question than putting out false narratives. And why is it that we don't know? It is similar to having a meal like this on it's a typical South Indian meal on a banana leaf. And after this meal, if you did have a tummy upset, and if you said it was because of this one or a combination of these one or two dishes that caused my tummy upset, that's a fairly large leap of faith. And the Indian electoral democracy is very similar to that. It's such a complex system because of its diversity, because of what's called an inappropriate first past the post system where you don't have to get a majority to win. Determining factors that influence and impact electoral outcomes are very, very difficult. But by attributing false narratives to outcomes, we run the risk of going down a completely wrong policy path because we think this is what cost a victory or a defeat of a political party. Thank you.